Hey everybody, welcome to today's live Wednesday workshop. My name is Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard and I'm a principal with Caliber Leadership Systems. We specialize in helping organizations to dismantle dysfunction and to really help their organizations to continue to grow and thrive and truly achieve their potential. Today, I'm continuing our discussion about permissive leadership. One of our favorite topics to talk about. It is a leadership dysfunction that is so prevalent in organizations today and a form of narcissistic defense, which most of us don't associate permissive leadership behavior with narcissism, but the two go hand in hand. It is just a more passive approach to demonstrated narcissistic defenses than what we typically think of when we think about narcissistic behavior. Because the leader at the end of the day is still really focused on their own image. Their behavior is all about them being seen as a good leader, rather than effective leader. So they're so focused on being a good leader that they end up being permissive and they fail to lead effectively. If you have missed our prior videos on this topic, I really encourage you to head on over to our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard, to catch up on all the videos that we've been posting over the last couple of months, I guess now, about narcissistic leadership dysfunction and its impact in organizations. Now, today, our particular focus around permissive leadership is all about abdicating leadership responsibility. Now, I can go on and on and on with examples of this. I can go on and about examples of this in my own leadership practices over the decades that I myself have been a leader and an entrepreneur. But I'm going to focus on sharing some specific examples so you can really start to understand this, how it shows up in organizations, how you can recognize when a leader is being permissive and when they're abdicating leadership responsibility. Because it doesn't always sound like it. The way they talk makes you think that they're actually making a conscious leadership choice, but really permissive leadership, one of the key symptoms of it, or one of the key approaches that is used by leaders that are being permissive, is this abdication of leadership responsibility. So it's a form of permissive leadership that really sets employees up to fail by not establishing expectations for our employees. So what is this all about and why are we talking about it? Again, this abdicating of leadership responsibility is a form of leadership, of permissive leadership, of the permissive leadership dysfunction. And it has a substantial impact on employees whenever our leaders fail to set expectations. And there's all kinds of different ways in which they will do it. And what's behind it, what's driving it, is this fear of exercising authority. It causes permissive leadership behavior, right? When we don't feel like we're entitled to exercise our authority, when we don't understand the authority that we can and should be exercising with leaders, if we haven't developed up our ability to understand how to exercise that authority, all of that will cause permissive leadership behaviors. And one of the interesting patterns that we've seen more and more emerging around setting expectations is where leaders will tell themselves, and obviously us as we're in there doing our work within our organizations with our clients, is that they cannot possibly set expectations for people because these individuals are professionals and it would be considered insulting. And this is a new one for me. I've just started to hear this in the last couple of years, really emerging as one of the ways in which those that are using the permissive leadership dysfunction let themselves off the hook, allow themselves to abdicate responsibility by saying to themselves it would be insulting if they were to actually provide leadership and direction and set expectations for individuals. Okay? And so this is really like, when you think about what happens in organizations, what I was saying earlier is that when the way the leaders will talk, you think they're being really objective and rational in their decision not to do something. But whenever we see someone not setting expectations, not bringing that absolute clarity around what is expected so that employees can be successful, this is a symptom, this is an indicator or a clue that permissive leadership is at work. And it is a dysfunction that contributes to dysfunction within organizations. Another excuse that I've heard, and I've heard this one recently, so it's really top of mind for me, is that there's absolutely no point. There's no point in saying this because it's not going to change anything. And so they just work around the gaps in performance that their employees may have or the behavioral difficulties that they're having. So again, emotional reasoning. They're using emotional reasoning to let themselves off the hook so they can actually abdicate responsibility for leading and in particular setting expectations. Now, why do we care about this? Why do we care about permissive behavior? Why am I out here every week talking to you and to others about it? And is because we see it as such a pervasive challenge in organizations. And it is dysfunctional, permissive leadership behavior costs the organization. And I bet as you're listening to this, you can probably think of examples in your own context or even maybe your own behavior where you've been using a permissive leadership approach as opposed to staying in that place of exercising and really leading with authority. And so we'd love to hear from you, love to hear your examples, some of your challenges and your frustrations. If you have a boss who's a permissive leader, if you're dealing with, coworkers that have permissive bosses, that can be a real challenge. I talked to a client the other day who's really struggling with that, where one of her peers has a very permissive leadership approach, and she's required to have that collaboration, and she's really dependent upon the input from this other individual's team, but they don't want to manage performance and doesn't want her to manage the performance of her own team as well. So really challenging dynamics that get created when people are practicing these permissive leadership behaviors that, again, it's a dysfunctional pattern. So it costs the organization, and it really negatively impacts employees, right? And that is because the impact on employees is that inability to feel like they're able to be successful, but it impacts the employees around them as well. So not just the employee that's receiving that permissive behavior, but pretty much everybody else around them, because there's no expectation, there's no holding people accountable. And one of the things that we talk about is that leaders, when we're dealing with this permissive behavior of leaders, is they have to stop blaming their employees. And this is one of the ways we always know that permissive leadership is at play, because leaders will talk about their employees as though they, as the leader, is completely powerless to do anything about it. And they blame their employees because their employees don't do this, or they don't do that, or they don't understand this, or they're not as motivated as they are. Whatever it is that they characterize their employees, they're putting the blame on the employees, and they're not actually taking responsibility for their employees' success in those situations. And that's why we call it abdicating leadership responsibility, right? Because they are looking to others to just be successful and to perform without actually having to go in and do the act of leading. And this is about, leading. It's an activity, it's a verb. And so we want to make sure that we're in there and we're not abdicating our responsibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some more examples as we go through the rest of the workshop here today, and talk about some of the skills that are involved in developing expectations and how do we get to that. Because again, permissive leadership, when we're using that dysfunctional approach, it's an indication of a developmental gap. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of really learning how to effectively develop expectations. And I know for myself, as a leader, it's taken me years and years and years, despite the fact that I help organizations to establish expectations for their staff. I help them write expectations. I help them bring clarity to those performance expectations to try and address that gap and help them to build their skills. But I even know for me, with my staff, but even with my kids, just the difficulty there can be for us in really bringing that clarity of setting expectations and holding people to account for it. And we have to help our leaders. So if you're in this position, or if you're in HR within an organization, really helping leaders to understand the dysfunction that they're creating and their role in it. Again, they're quick to blame the employee and to make it about the employee's behavior or their attitude or their sense of entitlement. All of those things, again, that allow us to make us feel like we're off the hook and we're powerless to do anything about it. But it's, again, us abdicating our responsibility to lead into that situation. And so we want leaders to really understand, to be able to see that, to see it in action, to see it how it plays out. I'm going to talk about some different examples to really help you to understand it, to make it more illustrative for you, so you can start to identify when you're using permissive leadership approaches or when people around you are, so you can start to talk about it. You can start to make it objective, to be able to speak to it objectively and without judgment, so we can actually focus on the developmental gap and resolve the issue there. And part of what participants need to do, or part of what we need leaders to do, is to move in this place about showing employees what success actually looks like, and not leaving it to employees who may not have the experience, who may have not had the exposure, who don't necessarily know intuitively how to be successful. I remember when I first started working in consulting many many years ago, I had a boss, and when you would bring something to him and he would say, no, that wasn't what I wanted, that's not what it was like. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't know what it was because I was learning. I was brand new to it. I was in my mid-20s. This was all new, trying to figure out. And he used to say to me, can't you just read my mind? Great example of permissive leadership, right? Is we want them to just know what's in our heads and be able to execute on it without us having to go into the specifics, to slow down long enough to really say, this is what it looks like if you're being successful, and this is what I need from you. And a client that I was talking to the other day, where we were actually talking about one functional area of the organization, and I was talking about the different causes. So they were talking about all the symptoms, all the problems that they're having, what they're complaining about. And so I started to talk about, okay, well, let's look at the underlying issues. Let's look at the barriers. Let's actually look at things that we can work to resolve. And one of the comments that I made was there was an undefined vision for this particular function by the executive team. And they said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, have you ever explicitly sat down and said, this is what success looks like for our business from this function? And they said, no, but we tell them what we want. And it's like, that's not the same thing as explicitly getting down and really saying, well, what does it look like to be successful? And how do we measure that success? And really getting the individual to see it and to understand it so that they can work towards it. That's part of our role as leaders, to really help to develop the performance of our people. Now, always highlight this, and every time we talk about dysfunction, it's normal, right? Dysfunction is a normal part of life in organizations. It's a normal aspect of leadership. And if you think about it, we often will say is that where there is function, there is the potential for dysfunction. And what we're trying to do is break down that dysfunction, because it tends to cause leaders and organizations on the collective level to feel like they can't do anything about it. It starts to feel too big and too overwhelming. And again, they go into blaming and complaining as opposed to going after what's the underlying root cause, what are the issues, and how do we work to resolve those issues. Dysfunctional leadership and behavior, permissive leadership behavior that we see in organizational leaders, is the direct result of leaders not having had the opportunity to build the skills necessary to lead effectively. So I'm curious, for all of you that are here listening and watching me live or catching it in the replay, how many of you had the opportunity to really develop your leadership skills before you were moved into a leadership role? And how many of you have had the opportunity, since you've been moved into a leadership role, to actually receive development? Because we're always watching and tracking this. I know from my experience, I was leading people without any training for many, many years. And most of my clients are in the same boat. There was nothing and so they were in the leadership role for decades, sometimes before they might even get access through some of our Leadership Foundations programs or our leadership coaching to actually be able to get the support to do the skill building that is necessary to be effective as a leader. So it's a developmental gap. Using that permissive leadership approach, that dysfunctional approach, is all about a skill gap. And when we give people the opportunity to build those skills, we can make them aware of those permissive practices and start to transition them because they've got new skills to use. But we talk about it and examine these behavioral patterns, not with judgment, but to really bring light on these actual issues and what it is that we can do to shift, because we have that ability to shift. We have that ability to go back into feeling powerful and really going after our own potential as leaders. So let's talk through some examples of permissive leadership. Okay, let's look at some of the things that we see all the time in our client organizations. Some of the things that we see happening, that not setting expectations, because again, that's our focus for today, that abdicating of leadership responsibility by not setting expectations for employees, and the impact of that dysfunction causing leadership approach. So let's look into kind of what happens and what's at play there. So first of all, I want to talk about an example around not setting or the dysfunction that emerges by a leader not setting expectations. And again, I acknowledge up front, we have many, many clients that struggle to set expectations. Not only do they struggle to set it because it pushes them out of their comfort zone, but they struggle to find the language, the words, and to be able to do it in a way that allows the employee to step towards it, right? And that's the thing about effective expectation setting, is it has to be done in a way that actually allows the employee to move towards it. And so one scenario that we're working through with the client right now is where they've got They have set no expectations. This is a leader of one of their functional areas. The clients have set no expectations, or the executive team has no clarity around expectations. And so what we're seeing is this whole pattern of, deadlines being missed, the leader thinking it's okay to wait, to do it on their own timeline. There's inaccuracies in the reports, or the reports just don't even make it to the individuals that require them. And there's continued frustration that gets expressed with that perceived gap in performance. But when we unpack all of that's going on, even though it's with a key leader in the organization, there are no expectations. There's no expectations. There's frustration gets expressed, or there may be comments or information given about it would nice to be have, or wouldn't it be great if, or we would really like. So they're given information, but they're really not moving into that place of expectation. And so what you see is the leader that's in this performance struggle here is able to do what they want to do and do it the way they feel like they want to do it, because there really isn't any expectation. And when there's no expectation, there's nothing that we can use as leaders to hold the individual accountable when they don't meet that expectation. And so we're hearing this, and this has been going on for quite some time, as is usually the case in scenarios like this, right? And again, hearing complaints, when leaders are complaining about their employees and talking about their employees as though they're powerless to do anything about it, we know that that is a clue that permissive leadership approach is at play. Now, in this situation, we're working with the direct managers to really define in writing the expectations, absolute crystal clarity around what is expected and how they're going to track and measure that performance, what the plan is to close the gap between where the individual is now and what those expectations are as well. Now, interestingly enough, in this situation, as we hear in most cases, both of the leaders that are involved, both of the direct managers, claim that they have communicated these expectations. So again, I've asked to see them. Okay, let me see them in writing. What have you got? Oh, well, we don't do it like that. And again, you think about yourself in that situation of not wanting it to write down, feeling some resistance to actually put it on paper. And one of the challenges we know is that there's a huge, huge difference between giving information, which is how we often communicate with others, and actually setting expectations that people can then work towards following and achieving, okay? Defining, and I would say permissive leaders really don't understand that, because it's again, their own resistance gets triggered when they're having to bring clarity to expectations, when they're having to write it down, right? And we always have to work through that resistance, but it's really, really key from a performance development perspective, because we need the individual to be able to internalize those expectations. So just giving them some information on the fly doesn't really let them focus in on it, nor does it let you bring it back out and say, how are we doing? How are we tracking? Where are we at with this? And so again, it's like this swoop in, drop, give information, move on, nothing changes, give more information, nothing changes. And this is the pattern we see with permissive leadership. And so some of you might be able to relate to that. Some of you might find that in your own expectation with your bosses. One of the things I find interesting, because I have one of my kids is in her first year of university, and she's always struggling with this. And she did in high school, and she's doing it again in university, where the teachers don't articulate the expectations. And so they're trying to guess. And I just keep telling her, this is really great experience for when you go out and work, because you will have bosses. I guarantee you are going to have bosses that will not define expectations for you, that they will abdicate that responsibility, and you're going to have to figure out what it is they want without them necessarily explicitly telling you, okay? So another thing that we see when in organizations where leaders are practicing this permissive leadership approach is that when we fail to set expectations for our employees, we then develop a reputation as a leader as being ineffective, unable to manage our people, and being overly tolerant of poor performance, right? Some of you can probably relate to that, if it's not even about yourself, but maybe it's about how other leaders in your organization are or have been characterized, right? And where we'll work around it, we'll take things over, and we'll allow these people to delegate up to us. But what happens is our own reputation as leaders starts to get undermined. And I have a client right now who's really struggling with this. Her tendency is to take a fairly permissive leadership approach and correcting through explanation versus expectation. So giving information versus giving direction. And she needs to quickly correct the behavior of one of her senior people, but she's really quick to excuse it. Oh, she's really busy. There's so much going on. I can kind of understand it. So she goes into that place of rationalizing and reasoning it out. But she also is doing it because she wants to protect her employees' feelings through the feedback process. Her concern, and one of her drivers, and this is very common with those that use the permissive leadership approach, is they don't want the other person to get upset. And what we miss in that delivery of that message when we're of expectations, when we're so focused on how they're going to feel, we choose our words, we sugarcoat it, and we diminish the actual messaging. When I was talking to another client the other day, and I said, you've got to, when you're dealing with this, you got to hit that nervous system so the person again can internalize the expectations. And so this client just wants to kind of give the information and again back off and think that the employee is going to change, and that's not the case. And again, common challenge for permissive leaders is that being overly focused on the needs of the employee or the emotions of the employee at the risk of the needs of the business. But the longer this situation goes on for my client, the less it is about her, the less it is about her direct report or the person where they've got the behavioral issue, and the more it becomes about her inability to lead her team. And that goes to the heart of her credibility, her success in the organization, and again, how she is viewed by her peers and ultimately her boss, the CEO. And so as we've discussed this, it gives that push out of her comfort zone to really tackle these behaviors head on and to draw some really clear lines for her direct report around some non-negotiable change in that employee's behavior, in particular at meetings. And that's where it's being acted out or played out. The last example I want to talk about is decline in performance and what happens when this abdicating of responsibility, this failure to set expectation goes on for an extended period of time. Over time, we know, and we've seen it over and over again, that permissive leadership and the use of permissive leadership approaches leads to a decline in employee and team performance. And it's inevitable, right? If nothing is being expected and people start to know nothing is expected and they can do whatever they want and there's no consequence for doing it, whatever they want, then again, there's nothing to hold them. There's no boundaries. There's nothing kind of pulling them up to say, this is what we want. We want to work to a higher standard. We want to go further with it. And instead, what we see is that while employees may start out with the absolute best intentions in terms of their performance and their contribution, the lack of expectations, the lack of corrective feedback, that lack of direction, tolerance for the poor performance of others, because we can see it, even if I'm new to an organization, if I step in, I'm working really hard and I see my boss is tolerating all kinds of bad behavior or poor performance from others, we naturally start to move kind of into alignment with everybody else. And so again, the performance level starts to drop. And it fosters entitlement in our employees, right? And that's an important thing to understand, because a lot of the times, again, when we're dealing with these permissive leadership leaders who are using the permissive leadership approach, is they were often quick to claim that the reason why their employees don't do anything is because their employees are so entitled. But they fail to really understand their role in fostering that entitlement. What we do as leaders, whether we show up and exercise our authority, we set expectations, we hold people accountable, that really makes the difference as to the level of employee entitlement that we are dealing with, okay? So what happens when we have a leader that's abdicated responsibility for setting expectations, again, is that over time, employees do what they feel like. Some of you probably have examples of maybe your direct reports or where you've seen this in others, and they don't necessarily show up the way they're expected. They do things the way they want to based on their own standards. There's a lack of compliance. They don't like to be told what to do. They think that if someone tells me what to do, I'm being micromanaged. Again, we see all of this erosion in performance and in the interaction around performance, the dynamic that happens over time. Employees start to talk about how hard they work versus their achievements and their effectiveness. Again, that's an indication of an abdication of responsibility, because they're applying their own measurement, which is, I'm really great because I worked so hard and I did the best that I possibly could. That's not an objective standard of performance. But when a leader's abdicating responsibility and not setting expectations, then employees start to apply their own subjective judgments about their performance. And then we end up into conflicts and, and disagreements around whether or not someone's entitled to a bigger raise or a promotion, okay? So again, employees will often start to shift their behaviors in ways that are less productive, further contributing to the dysfunction that was started because of a leader choosing to be permissive instead of effective. Okay, so not exercising your authority as a leader means that you're not setting expectations. You're abdicating that kind of responsibility where you're supposed to be in there directing your employees and really governing their performance. So what can leaders do? What can HR do to help their leaders shift from this permissive leadership dysfunction? And first and foremost, it's about awareness, right? The first step is always being aware that you are a permissive leader and that you use a permissive leadership dysfunction. It's a self-protective, defensive approach to leading. It has many ways of presenting itself. And again, it's all because of a developmental gap in the individual, in the person leading. So not setting expectations is just one of many collections of the behaviors that come from permissive leadership that really does contribute to organizational dysfunction. And it needs to be addressed as a systemic issue, not just focusing on the behavior of the leader, right? As with all dysfunctions in organizations, we need clarity of goals, expectations, and supportive systems to align behavior behind it, okay? We cannot overstate the importance of setting expectations and creating the platform for your employees' success. And we set these expectations not just once a year in the performance cycle, weekly, daily. It's an ongoing activity that is fundamental to our job as leaders. And so there's a few things that you can do to improve your ability to set and communicate expectations. Obviously, taking some course, doing some learning, reading up on it, very, very important. But what's more important is actually practicing creating expectations. One of the assignments we will often give to our coaching clients and even our clients that are in our Leadership Foundations programs is to write expectations for themselves. Right? Because if their boss hasn't given them expectations, it's a pretty safe place to start, is to think about defining and practicing on themselves, what do smart expectations look like? So specific, measurable. We want to really get in there so that we're being directive and not informational. The other thing that we really need to help leaders with in their development, or if you're working on this and you want to develop up a little bit further, is practice identifying behavioral expectations for employees. One of the ones we are writing into a lot of performance expectations or performance development and coaching development plans that we are writing is followership, right? Is that developing up that behavior of following. If I ask you to do something by this date, you get it done, right? But it's when we look at behavioral expectations, we don't just talk about the behavior we want them to stop doing. We really need to be able to articulate, what does success look like? What is that behavior we want them to strive towards, and really get them to work towards that. As you're practicing writing expectations, ask your peers or some of your other colleagues to review them and give you the opportunity to practice communicating them. Because as I said earlier, part of this is as having, for us that are working out of the permissive leader, is getting out of the discomfort of giving that direction, of being explicit, of exercising our authority. So again, practicing it in a safe space before we go to have the conversation with the employee that may offer some resistance to us is a really great way to continue to develop that skill set. And last but not least, ask yourself whether you're giving information or setting expectations. So let me give you a really clear example on this, because I know, again, as someone who struggles with permissive leadership practices, I have a tendency to give information. And the example that I always use when I'm talking to clients about this is when there was a day when I said to my kids, the dishes in the dishwasher were clean. I provided them with that information. In my mind, that information implied that they would take action, right? And how many of us do this as leaders? We say this, but we really want to give direction to do something with it. Now, of course, nothing happened with the dishes. I came back, the dishwasher had not been emptied because I gave information. I didn't set the expectation, which was before you go and do anything else, or before I get back home, you need to empty the dishwasher. I expect the dishwasher to be empty when I return. It doesn't seem like a lot, but you see the difference, right? One is directing, the other one is informational. And starting to just be aware of when you are communicating expectations or believe you are communicating expectations, really ask, was that information that I just gave, or was that direction? Okay? Setting expectations absolutely enhances your ability to lead and to manage performance. So it's up to you to show employees what success looks like. And if you aren't clear, they won't be either, and you won't get the performance and the behavior that you ultimately want. Having expectations template that you can work with them, so you make setting expectations a transactional aspect of the dynamic between yourself and your employee is another way to get, again, through that resistance and just make it a normal course of the way you do business around here. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and leave you off. Again, if you want more information on this, check out some more of our videos on permissive leadership and on dysfunctional leadership behavior on our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard. There's lots of videos there. We're adding new content, multiple times during the week. Lots of exciting things coming. We have more things coming up on permissive leadership. So stay tuned every Wednesday here with me live in LinkedIn at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. I'm back to talk to you more about permissive leadership as we continue to round out the rest of this year with our focus on dysfunctional leadership behavior. And if you want more information, if you really want to learn more about permissive leadership and how to develop up as a leader, in order to be able to exercise authority or lead with authority, I'll reach back behind here. Pick up a copy of our book, So You Think You Can Lead. This is the whole book. We started to write this book, and when we first started to write this book, it was because we were dealing with so many clients that were struggling with permissive leadership practices and behaviors, and we really wanted to understand what was the driving force behind it, but more importantly, what can we do to develop and to move beyond permissive leadership, really to be able to lead with authority and to achieve our potential as leaders. So until next time, thanks everyone for joining me. If you're catching me live, thank you so much. If you're catching this in the replay, please reach out to us, send us your comments, your thoughts, and if you have some topics of interest to you, always happy to hear from you. Until next time, my name is Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and I'm a principal with Caliber Leadership Systems. I'm an expert in organizational development and behavioral change, and so happy to have been here with you today.